today's webinar brings together a small panel of policy experts, welcome to all of you as well, who we'll introduce shortly, to reflect on the implications for education of the Chancellor's autumn statement that we heard yesterday, reflecting on current issues and up-to-date statistics. They will consider the levels of school funding required to ensure all pupils meet their potential, and discuss how the main political parties may look to tackle funding issues in the development of their manifestos ahead of the next general election. So after the panels make their contribution, there'll be a Q&A and a chance for you to ask your questions, make any observations. And we are going to record the event and make it available afterwards. So I am now delighted to introduce Sam Booth. Welcome, Sam, who's Chief Reporter at Schools Week, and she's going to chair the webinar and start by introducing our panel. So thank you all very much. Over to you, Sam.
Thanks so much, Leslie. Good afternoon, everybody. As mentioned, I'm Sam Booth. I'm Chief Reporter at education newspaper Schools Week. Huge thanks to the National Foundation for Education Research, or NFER as we all know them, for hosting today. Hopefully you all know who NFER are, but they are hugely supportive in the education sector, providing key data and analysis on a big thing we look at is teacher workload and teacher workforce, but I know you do so much across the sector on these things. So firstly, I just want to quickly introduce each panelist and then I'll run through the format of the event. So joining us today is Andrew Harrop, General Secretary at the Fabian Society, Jenna Julius, who's Research Director at NFER, and Angus Walker, who is an Account Director at Denford Associates and a former Special Advisor to the Education Secretary. So first off, each panellist will have about 5 minutes to offer their own reflections on the autumn statement yesterday and the impact for schools. And then we'll have about a 15-minute discussion between ourselves on what came up and what might come up in the future. And then we'll open it to Q&A in the audience. Just a technical thing, if you do wish to ask any questions today, if you can use the Q&A part of Zoom, hopefully you can see a little button at the bottom rather than the chat. Use the chat. If you've got any technical problems, raise it in there and the NFER team will pick it up. If you could just put your questions in the Q&A, that'll make sure that we see them. So first up, if Jenna would like to open with her starting thoughts.
You can all see my screen. So today I'm just going to be speaking for the next 5 to 10 minutes, giving our initial reflections on the autumn statement, on what was or wasn't committed, as it were. I'm going to start by talking about the kind of funding context going into the autumn statement and then move on to kind of looking to the future. So in terms of thinking about the current funding context, so last year the school's budget increased by about 4 billion, which in cash was a big cash terms increase for mainstream schools. They saw an increase of about 6.7%. Which, before accounting for inflation, was a really big rise. However, we know that the cost of living crisis has been affecting all our lives over the last year, and schools have clearly been no exception to that. So in order to better understand the ways in which cost of living pressures have been affecting schools, we conducted research earlier this year funded by the Nuffield Foundation, drawing on surveys of teachers and senior leaders in over 2,500 mainstream and special schools, trying to better understand these pressures. And what was quite clear is that while schools have been directly impacted by cost of living pressures in terms of increases in energy costs, increases in staffing costs, increases in food costs, they've also seen a really significant increase in both the numbers of pupils requiring additional support and their level of need. And where I talk about additional support here, I mean support over and above what a school might usually provide. And as you might expect, the sorts of increased need that schools were seeing was in terms of welfare and financial support, so more pupils coming into school hungry, more pupils coming into school without the necessary equipment or clothing, but also in terms of increased levels of well-being and mental health needs, which are issues that we've clearly already seen have been sort of exacerbated by the pandemic. And this is important when we think about the kind of school funding context, because most schools are taking significant steps to help meet these people's needs. So you can see that on the chart on this slide, which shows this for primary schools, shows over 90% of senior leaders reporting that they were providing subsidies for extracurricular activities for uniforms and clothing, over 70% providing food parcels, food vouchers, subsidised breakfast to their pupils. And while we know that much of this might go beyond the statutory responsibilities of schools, the reality is if pupils are coming into school hungry or without necessary clothing, it's clear that giving them the support is necessary in order for them to engage with their education. And we know that a lot of this support isn't new. You know, these are things that schools have been doing for some time, and that only scaled up during the pandemic. But what is new is that this support has expanded in scale and scope. More pupils are in need of support than before. Schools are taking more measures than they might have been doing before. And this is only being compounded by the fact that external services are not giving schools the support they need. So just to illustrate this, only around 1 in 5 teachers in mainstream schools and just under a quarter of teachers in special schools reported feeling supported by child and young people's mental health services. And while again, we know that's not necessarily a new trend, I think what our research highlighted is that's only got worse. So about a fifth of the mainstream teachers in our survey reported that the support that they've received this year from child and young people mental health services was worse than the previous year. So schools are having to contend with a much higher level of need. And on top of that, the wider funding pressures on other services means that even more of that need is falling on schools. And the result of this has been that schools have been having to make cuts. And that's both in response to the direct impact of cost of living pressures on their budgets. And it's also in terms of the cost of providing this additional support that I've just been talking about. So about 4/5 of the senior leaders who responded to our surveys reported that they were making cuts. And you can see on the chart on this slide some of the types of cuts that schools were having to make. So this chart only shows that for mainstream schools, but you see a very similar story for special schools as well. So just to illustrate, you know, over 3/5 of primary schools cutting spending on learning resources. That's things like printed worksheets, library books. Over half of primary schools cutting their number of teaching assistants or hours, and 4/5 cutting targeted learning support. So that's things like the National Tutoring Programme. So really, it's quite clear that the impact of these cuts is not just on kind of the wider activities around school, enrichment activities, extracurriculars, which are really important, but it's also affecting the core teaching and learning, the bread and butter of schools. And unsurprisingly, teachers and senior leaders were telling us that their kind of teaching and learning has been impacted by these cost-saving measures. On top of the fact that schools are making cuts, we also found that schools were reporting that cost of living pressures had a considerable negative impact on their financial positions. And this is only one of a number of critical challenges that schools are facing at the current time. So this isn't intended to be a sort of comprehensive list. I think we could talk about this for some time, but we've only got a couple more minutes. So I'll just briefly touch on some of the other challenges. So we know that meeting the needs of pupils with special educational needs and disabilities, you know, we know the system's been broken for some time. And I think what's new in the current context is that this has only become a kind of more increasing pressure and challenge for schools. That again came through our survey and kind of senior leaders reporting their concerns around meeting people's needs and having the funding to meet people's needs. And the reality is that while the the SEND an alternative provision improvement plan does set out plans to improve the system, these plans are going to need to be accelerated, but also most likely that's going to need to come with additional funding. Secondly, capital investment. We've spoken a lot in the school sector about concrete over the last 3 months or so. But the reality is that that's only part of the challenge. The DFE estimated back in 2001 that there were around 700,000 pupils in schools that needed major refurbishment or rebuilding. And just last week, the Public Accounts Committee flagged that the DfE's current plans only touch the surface of the problems with the school estate. And one thing that came out of our cost of living work, which you might have spotted on the last slide, is that all of this intersects with the wider funding pressures which schools are facing. So schools in that last slide, you might have seen that schools were telling us they were cutting on building and maintenance spending as a result of cost of living pressures. So all of these things are being pushed down the line. Not only do we have big challenges today, but cost of living pressures today on schools are then meaning that we're storing ourselves up for an even bigger problem in the future. Demographic decline, so that's a kind of another big major issue that's going to be facing schools in the coming years. So primary pupils are projected to fall by about 800,000 pupils into the next decade. And while that's not necessarily just about the kind of level of funding, it's about how funding is allocated and ensuring that schools, that we're planning for the decline in pupil numbers, but schools are adequately funded through that. So a large amount of funding is pupil-led, and the concern is that reducing pupil numbers could mean that schools just don't have the funding to balance their books. And finally, staff recruitment and retention. Both Sam and Leslie touched on it earlier. We know that's a really big challenge. And while pay is only part of the issue, it's clear that that's going to be a critical lever to play as workforce challenges continue. And it's worth saying staff recruitment retention challenges, often we talk about teachers, but it's not just teachers where the challenges are. We know it's also affecting teaching assistants, school business managers, staff all across schools. So a large number of different issues affecting schools going into yesterday's autumn statement. And even going into the autumn statement yesterday, we also know that kind of funding pressures were likely to be set to stay for the kind of foreseeable future. So cost of living pressures, while it might not be on the news in the same way as it was, and while inflation might be lower than it was, we know that they're set to stay. So the Office for Budget Responsibility are anticipating that living standards are going to continue to fall this year and are going to remain below pre-pandemic levels until 2027, 28. So for some time to come. So these issues are not going away. We are going to likely to continue to see pupils and their families being affected by this. Before the autumn statement, the Institute for Fiscal Studies were anticipating that cost pressures would be slightly lower than funding growth for the coming year. But it's important to recognise there's large amounts of uncertainty going ahead. Not all schools are being equally impacted by cost pressures. And also, these estimates don't account for these additional steps that schools are needing to take in order to support pupils and their families with the current pressures. And in our survey, while we know that we do need to consider self-reported data on school finances carefully, just under half of mainstream schools and 2/5 of special schools were expecting both to have an in-year deficit and needing to make further cuts to provision in the coming academic year. And so that brings us nicely on to what came out of yesterday's autumn statement. So for those of you who have watched the news in the last 24 hours, it won't be a surprise that there was no new funding for schools. So clearly all of the challenges set out in that last slide still remain. Schools are also going to be impacted by what's going on with families, by what's going on in local government. And what was also quite clear from yesterday is that there was also limited new support for low-income families, an increase in the living wage, benefits being uprated in line with inflation. Low-income families will also benefit as much of the population will from the national insurance cut. But all of this is likely to pale in comparison to the sort of scale of the challenge and isn't likely to make a big difference to low-income families as a whole over and above what's already out there. So all in all, not much for schools and not much or nothing for schools and nothing to suggest that that wider situation is going to get any better. Another important thing from yesterday's autumn statement is that the Office for Budget Responsibility's forecast for average earnings for the coming year increased from 1.7% earlier this year to 3.6%. And that's really important when we're thinking about likely levels of teacher salaries, but also support staff salaries in schools for 2024-25 and their likely levels, because it means that the funding settlement for next year is likely to need to be larger to accommodate that. So what next? Well, we would say that clearly the risk of not addressing cost pressures is that they have far-reaching and long-lasting impacts on pupils. So we've seen that schools are already making cuts that are affecting the teaching and learning of pupils, and it's the most disadvantaged schools who are seeing the biggest levels of need, who are those who in our survey were most likely to say that they were making cuts. So in all expectation, that's only going to entrench and widen existing gaps that we know exist between disadvantaged pupils and their more affluent peers, which for us says that we need more action now. In the short term, that's greater financial support to schools and families. But in the longer term, it's clear that we need to be looking beyond the school gates. Schools are stepping in to provide services and support because of where these are lacking from other services. And the issue is schools don't have that specialism, that expertise, and that's diverting resource from the bread and butter. So there's also a question of looking at that increased capacity and responsiveness of those wider services around schools. Other steps that might want to be looked at are anything that's going to enable better forward planning for schools, because all of those things are going to enable schools to make better decisions about how they spend their money and are less likely to be in those positions where they're having to make cuts because of unexpected changes at the last minute. We know that teacher salaries have recently been set after local authority schools have committed to their budgets for the coming financial year. It's a really difficult situation for schools to be making plans in that context, and any steps we can take which will help schools with that are likely to help ease some of those pressures. So I'll wrap up there and hand over back to Sam.
Thanks so much, Jenna. That was brilliant scene setting, I think, of what schools have been going through the last couple of years, and it has provided a really helpful starting point. And of course, yes, we had hardly any news yesterday from the autumn statement, but hopefully we can still have a good discussion about what we need, I guess. Just going to hand over now to Andrew.
Thanks, Sam. So hi, everyone. I'm Andrew Harrop. I'm the General Secretary of the Fabian Society, which is a think tank that looks across all domestic policy. We do some work on education and schools, but we basically try to look at all public services. And as many of you will know, we are a left-wing think tank affiliated to the Labour Party. And so I will say a little bit about what I think Labour might do if they are elected next year, given the backdrop that's been set by the autumn statement. But first, let me say a little bit about the statement yesterday itself, picking up on some of the things we've already heard. And the first thing to talk about is the sort of the state of the economy and family finances that the statement sort of like set out. So we are seeing a absolutely massive drop in family incomes over the course of this parliament. So in terms of once you've taken inflation out of the picture, most households are going to be considerably less well off than they were at the start of the parliament in 2019. And that, of course, particularly is an issue for lower income families. So, the backdrop for school leaders is that their families, their children and parents, and their lower paid staff are really struggling. And there was nothing that we saw yesterday that sort of changed that picture. I mean, there was the good news of a big increase in the national living wage, which of course is very helpful for low paid workers. But we saw what purported to be a tax cut, but actually it was only the offsetting of a very big tax rise for most people. So we have the national insurance cut yesterday, but actually that is just a small sort of like offset to really big increases in income tax and national insurance that are going on year after year, because the thresholds on those taxes have been frozen while people's incomes have been rising because of inflation. We also saw for families on social security some good news. So the good news was that the benefits were uplifted in full, and for those who rent in the private sector, the housing allowance for those families was reset. But we're getting rid of the cost of living payments that have basically been a lifeline for low-income families this year with energy bills. So they disappear after this financial year. So a lot of people are going to have less money next year in real terms than they had this year. So that sort of paints a sort of a continuing picture of, you know, disadvantaged children in schools with less money around them. All the issues of COVID catch-up still, you know, sort of really dominating in a lot of schools, as well as the sort of longer-term issues around mental health for children, and also increasingly physical health for lots of parents, with just much higher levels of disability in the working age population than we had a few years ago. So none of that's great. And then looking at the sort of the picture for public services. So what happened yesterday was basically the government's plans for spending on public services over the next few years didn't change, despite inflation being so much higher. And that basically translates into a planned cut in real terms in public spending for public services across the board. And basically the Institute for Fiscal Studies calculates that is a £13 billion cut to public service spending this year, adding up to a £19 billion cut in 2 years' time. And that's for day-to-day spending. It's even worse for capital spending. You referred a few moments ago to sort of concrete issues in schools, but basically across the public services, capital investment has been frozen in cash terms, and with inflation, you know, sort of roaring ahead, that means there's going to be far less for building and equipment in the past. So again, talking about the numbers that the IFS have published, they reckon, looking at schools itself over this parliament, that an expectation before the numbers announced yesterday was that schools would be getting an increase of 2.9% over the course of the parliament each year. And in light of yesterday's announcement, it's now 1.9% increase. So this is what happens when inflation goes up and spending plans don't change to compensate. Another way of putting it is that you had your financial settlement announced in July, particularly after the settlement of the pay disputes, and that settlement is now worth less than it was because of more up-to-date figures on inflation. And that means that, you know, come next year, there are likely to be higher pay pressures because of earnings being pushed up across the economy faster than was expected, and huge uncertainty about how much money there'll be. You know, if nothing changes, schools will not have enough money to pay a likely pay settlement. Now, the chances are that a government will have to do something to change the settlement that's been announced. But if you just look at the plans announced today, what's in the statement documents is that there's no change. So we'll see what happens. A final thing just to mention in passing is the early years package, which of course many schools are involved in delivering as early years providers as well. So there have been huge concerns that the announcements made at the budget last year were underfunded massively in terms of how much, you know, sort of those new entitlements for children from babies onwards. The Chancellor yesterday didn't increase at all the sort of size of the package for new entitlements, but he actually took some money away from that package. They reduced by £0.6 billion the overall amount of spending on childcare, because some of the subsidies that parents had previously been getting are now going to be lower, but that money is not going into support for the early years sector. So I know that will affect some of you. Let me just turn to what I think this means for a future Labour government if one is elected next year. So the way I think about the autumn statement is that it was a trap being set for a future Labour government, because the numbers are just totally implausible for what any government of any political party will want to do after the next election in terms of setting budgets for public services. The spending numbers assume huge cuts to public services, which probably wouldn't, sort of on the face of it, affect schools, because I think any party would probably continue with the existing commitment to per pupil real terms sort of stability. But the problem is that the numbers assume in other areas that there would be big cuts to public services, which just look totally implausible. So if you think about justice or local government, all sorts of really important areas of public services that aren't currently protected by the Conservatives' spending plans, they see just totally implausible falls under the announcements that have been made in the last 48 hours. So what I think that means for Labour is that Labour will have to find more money just to keep things standing still. So you can imagine needing to find extra revenue, and this is all assuming that the economy doesn't suddenly pick up quickly. But if it's as bad as the current projections suggest, they may need to raise taxes just to stop things going further backwards. While I'm sure loads of us on this call would, hope a new Labour government would significantly increase spending, but I think just to make sure that there aren't cuts, they're going to have to find extra money. They are making some very important commitments specifically for schools. Particularly, they have one of their largest commitments on tax specifically is earmarked for schools, and that's the tax rise for private schools, which will raise over £1 billion and will be ploughed straight back into the state school system. So that is, obviously a welcome measure. Compared to the scale of the challenge, it's going to be helpful for the first year. It's not going to transform the outlook for education. And I think that what I want to leave you with is basically to manage expectations. That I think that education has always been a massively high priority for Labour, but the reality is, and I'm sure many people in this call will find this hard to believe, but schools are in a better state than many other parts of the public services and have got a degree of protection on their spending outlook over the next few years compared to many other public services. So I think that you are likely to see modest uplifts from an incoming Labour government, but no more than that. I don't think you're going to see a transformation in spending on the school sector, because there are just so many pressures across the public realm. And as I said a moment ago, the starting point in the public finances published yesterday was more cuts. So the first job an incoming government will have to avoid those cuts before it then moves on to spending increases. So there's good news. There is some more money to come because of the private school tax policy, but only a little bit. So I'm sorry that may feel like a bit of a disappointment, but there isn't a sort of a knight in shining armor ready to completely transform the outlook for school finances.
Thanks so much, Andrew. Yeah, Labour have been saying, haven't they, that money will be tight. They've made a point of saying that multiple times, I think. And hand over finally to Angus now before we get into our question and answer.
Thanks very much, Sam. First things, I would shy away from being described as an education policy expert quite vigorously, but I'm a former political correspondent and therefore covered education through that lens. I was political correspondent for ITV, and then I was a media advisor to the Education Secretary in 2020, 2021. So that intense time during the pandemic, but I haven't worked in government before or since. So I had a very peculiar experience in government, and one where there weren't many good options, but we can leave that for another day, and there's an inquiry looking at that now. So I just thought I'd give my sort of overall impressions of what the autumn statement said about education, and the short answer is it didn't say very much, as we've all agreed on this webinar. But I do agree with Andrew in his overall broad assessment that schools overall, probably since 2017, have had a better deal than many other government departments. I know that for many people will find that sort of hard to believe or hard to take, but I think that is the case. I think in terms of what the autumn statement did in public spending terms was the Chancellor used everything he had got, every benefit he'd got from higher inflation, increasing receipts to the Treasury, and basically spent it all. And so you are, going back to Andrew, setting a trap for the Labour Party, and the Labour Party is now effectively having to vote for £19 billion worth of public spending cuts. And then the question is, where are you going to get that money from if Labour went on to win the next election, as they look set to do? Then they would be left with this quandary of where are we going to find all this money to fill the gap in public spending that this very generous Mr. Hunt has left us with. But broad zooming out politically, often governments try to leave that sort of scenario as they approach a general election. Remember Liam Byrne's famous note that he left on his desk in the Treasury when he departed, saying there's no money left. You don't actually want to leave, cynically speaking, but this is a broad Westminster law, if you like. You don't want to leave your opposition with lots of money to play with when they look likely to replace you. So there is that. I think the lack of announcements around education in this autumn statement also lends itself to the feel of an autumn statement before a general election, because if you ask the public, for example, I work with a think tank called More in Common quite closely, and if you ask, they every month ask people what their top issues are, education comes way down the list of top issues on any given month. Cost of living has been consistently the _1 issue for the public month after month for about the last 2 years, according to their polling and focus groups. So that's something that's well worth mentioning, and that gets us into cost of living. And I think for schools, the pressures from the cost of living crisis have been immense, because you're talking about a big public delivery area. In terms of the Department for Education, they are a big public delivery department. They are the face of the state in millions of people's lives. So there is that contact between government and citizen in the education world that you don't quite get in other areas. You certainly get it in health, but luckily most of us don't end up in the dock in a court case, for example. So have little to do with the Ministry of Justice, for example. But on cost of living, I don't think schools are, if we zoom out, they're not an isolated case, in that a lot of the pressures on cost of living have been imported from the war in Ukraine and from post-COVID global supply chain issues leading to price rises, notably in energy. And so a lot of those pressures are to some extent temporary, in that we expect them to ease. We hope that wars end, and we hope that supply chains improve after major shocks. And that seems to be happening. But I noticed in the OBR assessment of the autumn statement that they expect inflation to remain quite stubborn and more domestically driven. And two things there. I mean, domestically driven inflation will be good news for a Treasury, because they actually see an increase in receipts. And so I think the Chancellor might be hoping that that will give him another dollop of money to dish out in March. Now, if we do think there's going to be a spring election, some people do, some people don't, then certainly this coming March, you would imagine a pre-election Chancellor in the March budget to be wanting to do a bigger giveaway this autumn statement, in the scheme of things, if you compare to other giveaways, it was a giveaway. The 2% national insurance cut was. Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a large extent, he gave money in one hand and took it away with the other. It was always thus, perhaps, with autumn statements and budget. But back to the cost of living, I think those pressures will continue to be felt, certainly in schools and certainly by parents, families, carers. And we all know people in our lives who have had it very tough over the last couple of years, and it's not easy. And schools are having to be balancing their budgets and also finding money they'll be finding money for the rise in the living wage and minimum wage. So a lot of pressures on schools. I think overall, though, the spending on schools, you'd imagine, would probably improve if a Labour government wins the next election, because you'd expect a Labour government to want to increase public spending. The rhetoric from both the main political parties around education is really positive. And I think we've probably all agreed that there's certainly been a gap between the rhetoric from this government and the actual delivery of funding. And so there will be pressure on the Labour Party to match their own rhetoric with actual spending. And now, in light of this autumn statement, back to that question again, they're going to be left with a big question of where they're going to find money from. And I think parties will have to look longer term about, I think, fundamental changes to the education structure in this country. Perhaps it will be interesting to see what Labour's early years review comes back with. And I think that other aspects will have to be looked at in terms of how we structure education in this country, and see if there are other ways of making efficiencies. I mean, perhaps with work, perhaps new technology can reduce workload. Perhaps we can look at other ways of structuring the school year, and demographic changes will no doubt come in. So overall, I'll just wrap up now. I think I've gone on, hit my time, but I think overall, the autumn statement very much signaled that, unfortunately for many people listening, that education will be falling down the political agenda, having been actually a focus of political debate and scrutiny for much of the pandemic, of course, and post-pandemic, and of course during the pay disputes we've seen over the last 12 months. But I think we'll see education falling down the political agenda, with a big expectation on the Labour government to come in and make sure, at least solidify and increase as much as they can education spending. But I don't expect any big announcements or extra money from this government. In fact, in going back to my experience of being inside the DFE, I mean, we were constantly, I think like any other government department, what you don't realise is, and I certainly didn't realise as an outsider going into government, was you fight the Treasury every day of every week, and getting money out of them is very difficult. And culturally speaking, at the moment across Whitehall, the sense from the Treasury is that education, the DFE has had squillions since certainly 2019, and there isn't any more for education. So I wouldn't expect any large announcements on education between now and the next general election. It looks very much like those general election war rooms are firing up, and everyone is focusing on the two main issues which most voters mostly worry about, and that's the economy and health. And I think I'll end it there.
That was really helpful. Thank you, Angus. And it kind of answered my first question, which I think I might get rid of, which was about, are we surprised we didn't see more school funding? From what Angus was saying, he's not really, because of how this autumn statement was going to work. But one thing I just wanted to touch on, perhaps Jenna, you can help it on this. We did see, like you've mentioned, the announcement about the national insurance contributions for the employed dropping from 12 to 10%, and also increases in the national living wage. And I'm just wondering if schools will feel some impact of that at all in any way.
So with the national insurance increase, I think Andrew touched on this, it's worth saying that this is small in the context of the tax rises that are already happening. So it's basically you're cutting national insurance, but because of inflation, the sort of thresholds for paying tax are effectively the threshold is becoming lower because of the inflation. So it's a kind of misnomer to think that it's going to make the situation better for people. And in terms of thinking about low-income families, it's actually quite a relatively regressive approach. So it's not an approach that a government who really wanted to focus their attention on supporting low-income families would necessarily have taken. So all of that will help families. National living wage will also help families, but that will help working families. So this is not going to help families who are on universal credit. It's also for schools worth noting that while a lot of support staff in schools will be on local government contracts, there may also be some staff in schools who aren't on those contracts. So it may also increase costs for low paid staff in schools. So it will help families to a degree, but it could also create some additional costs on schools. I think fundamentally it's not going to change the overarching picture that schools are seeing and the overarching challenges that they're currently having to contend with.
Brilliant, that's really helpful. Thanks, Jenna. Right, I'm just going to turn to the Q&A. So do send them in now on the Q&A function. First off, we've got a question on, are you aware if the government or Labour have any plans or budgets to improve access to technology in schools? It seems to be an ambition on both sides, but since the COVID grant, there doesn't appear to be any provision being made for schools to be able to fund this moving forward. So DfE has been talking a lot about AI, I guess, but this seems to be about the wider technology piece in schools. Does anybody want to take that first?
Well, I'd point out that the Oak National Academy has been given £2 million to pursue and test AI tools for teachers in the classroom with the aim of what they're describing as providing teachers with an AI assistant. So there is that going on. I think that gives me the sense that the focus is on how can we best use AI in education to reduce workload and pressure on staff. And we know that workload is one of the key reasons around retention and recruitment, that it's a stubborn problem. And so I think that's where the government focus is, and that £2 million is not necessarily a lot. It's a lot of money, but in the scheme of things in government spending, it's not a great deal of money. So let's see what comes from that. But I think across education, I work with a number of schools and trusts now in my current job, and there is a lot of interest in what artificial intelligence and AI can bring in terms of helpful tools.
Great. Does anybody else want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I just say that I think there is a huge opportunity over the next decade, 15 years. It could really change the face of learning, but I think it's about personalized learning and the role of technology and fantastic teachers side by side to improve and personalize outcomes. I don't think it's a money saver. So I think that you're not going to see a substitution of lots fewer people in the classroom in favor of technology, but I think it could augment their ability to really support each learner.
Jenna, do you want to add anything?
I was just going to add that just to what Angus and Andrew have said, that it's worth bearing in mind that in terms of, clearly this is going to become an increasing focus, not just within schools, but also around areas like assessment, and the world is certainly going to change, but it's worth being mindful that some of those digital gaps that we became really aware of during COVID are still here. So in our survey, and it hadn't got any worse since COVID, but there was still about 1 in 5 primary school pupils and 1 in 4 in secondary, where senior leaders were telling us that they had little or no access to IT at home. So all of this kind of digital strategy moving to kind of more AI, moving to more technology use, needs to keep in mind those poorest children in society and making sure that we're still helping them to bridge that gap to be able to access learning.
Great, thanks so much. We've got a question from Ellie Costello here. Is the decline in numbers through the bill at primary simply a falling birth rate, or does this also indicate numbers of families electing to home educate or choose alternative education, such as online and hybrid schools? And how are deregistrations at primary and beyond captured in terms of per head funding projections? Jenna, I know you touched on this in your opening remarks, didn't you, about what we might see over the next couple of years in terms of primary school funding. I don't know if you want to come to this.
So I wouldn't be able to tell you the ins and outs of the DFE approach in terms of how they estimate this, but the bulk of the change in pupil numbers is going to be driven by birth rates, migration trends, assumptions around that, rather than, I wouldn't imagine there would be big assumptions baked in there around how those things are going to change, unless there was, I think we don't have strong reasons to believe, say, that deregistrations are going to massively increase over the next decade. So I wouldn't expect it to be something, that you can really incorporate into a forecast model, or something that DFE have been able to capture. I think the key point is that the birth rate changes are large enough that it seems like the pupil population is going to change quite significantly. But obviously these are projections, so we're expecting the birth rate to fall, but that might not necessarily be borne out in the data. But certainly, I think what I would say around this whole issue is it's one where kind of government approach at the moment has been very much passive. And I think the key thing in the current funding context, particularly given that money is so tight, taking a more proactive approach to planning for this decline is going to be really important to make sure that, having lots of pupils in kind of half-funded schools isn't going to be good either for those pupils or for the leaders in those schools or for the staff in those schools. So we need to be taking a more active approach to planning for this to ensure that we're using the resources that we have as effectively as possible.
Great, thanks so much. The next one I'll come to is about tutoring. Angus, you might be interested in this because I think you were at the DFE, right, when the National Tutoring Programme was announced. So there's two questions. One is, it's been suggested that disadvantaged gaps, post-pandemic may take a decade to return to pre-pandemic levels. Taking this into consideration, do you feel it's likely that the government will extend funding for tutoring past this academic year? And how can we encourage the positive impact of the NTP on closing the disadvantaged attainment gap to continue if funding for it ends and school budgets are strapped? What do we think Labour's stance on this might be, and what their plans for reducing the disadvantaged attainment gap might be? So in terms of the background on that, funding for the NTP comes to an end this year. It's 50% subsidied this year, and as far as I'm aware, nothing's been announced at all on the future of that. So Angus, I don't know if you've got any starting views on that.
Yes, I mean, I can give you a couple of points really that come to mind. Is I do remember the very painful birth that NTP had, and we had a battle on our hands with the Treasury at the time. I mean, I remember distinctly the Treasury wanting to restrict the NTP to 1 year. And we were arguing that, that was, not even practical, because the amount of money that was announced in the first round of catch-up funding, if you cast your mind back to, I think, June 2020, we're talking. So, very quickly, the DFE went into, we need to think about catch-up. If you think about the gap between the time from March, the first lockdown being announced, and June, the first, I think, £3 billion being announced, that goes to show that it does take a long time to get those things started from scratch, but it does prove that the thinking started straight away, and teams of civil servants were on it, and did very, very good work. But that amount of money, you couldn't have spent it in one academic year. You'd have to hoover up every single tutor in the land and make them work 24 hours, 7 days a week. And that was the argument we were having with the Treasury. But it just goes to show, I think, background-wise, there was no appetite originally for the National Tutoring Programme to be long-term. But of course, once you get something off the ground, golden rule of government is it's more difficult to take things away than it is to give them. So I can't see the government wanting to, or I can't see the DFE getting the money to continue with the subsidies, if you ask me for my best guess. And then, given that Labour has criticised the NTP quite heavily, I'm not sure that I have very hopeful forecasts for its future at this stage, if you just look at what's been said about it. But is it a help? Absolutely, it's a help. And also, I think it gave access to tutoring for the first time to pupils who come from backgrounds where actually access to the sort of tutoring that can be obtained by families from leafy parts of the country, it's normal in some parts of the country to have a tutor, especially in areas where the 11 plus still exists and so on. But this was incredibly helpful, and I think it's one of the best silver linings, if you like, to come out of the pandemic, is that it did broaden access for tutoring and normalized it a bit more. I'd love to see it continue. I didn't think the subsidies should be cut at all. If you ask me for my opinion, which doesn't count for anything, but I think it's going to be a big question for an incoming government as to whether they can do something similar or keep it going. Oh, one final point is a lot of the tutoring companies involved, for example, like one of the largest providers, is now giving up to 100,000 free online tutoring places as a result. So there are some of the companies involved are actually trying to do their own way of keeping it going, which shows you how successful it is and how determined some of these companies are to continue giving that provision. Sorry, I've gone on a bit long.
Andrew, I don't know if you just want to quickly, perhaps, if you have any views on what Labour might do. I think we've tentatively heard that Bridget Phillipson said she'd be open to looking at the most successful interventions when it comes to disadvantage and catch-up, but I don't know if we've had any commitment really on specifically.
As you say, there hasn't been any commitment, and Labour will be very focused on catch-up and school, and inequalities between children, and that might mean continuing special schemes, but I think it's more likely that would feed into mainstream funding and sort of readjusting the formula to take more account of disadvantage. So yeah, I think with all I caveated everything I said with there won't be very much money, but I think that when they come to make that first round of investment, they will probably attach some strings to it and sort of specify. They've already said that they want better mental health provision, but I suspect that catch up and support for disadvantaged children will be sort of part of their first package.
Great, thank you. I'm just really conscious of the time. I might try and squeeze one last question in, if that's all right. There's a question here from Bart Crisp. It's a bit of a long question, but I'll read it because I think it's important. It's striking how much of this discussion and other parallel ones focuses on schools supporting young people through financial problems and mental health and/or special needs challenges. It feels like the ostensible main role of schools educating young people is getting crowded out by these important challenges. The question that feels like it needs to be asked is, what are the likely long-term consequences of schools being focused on, distracted by economic issues beyond teaching and learning? And should we expect this to be the new normal for some time to come? And if so, for how long? So I think this feeds into the thing about the school being kind of like the new front line, as it were, of social care, mental health, all sorts. Sorry, the light's going off in here, which isn't helpful. I don't know, Jenna, if you've got any thoughts on that, on how that might play out.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is fundamentally, it's a much, we're talking about the acute problem right now, but actually it's a much bigger question to be asking ourselves around what do we want schools to do? What do we think schools should be doing? And I do think, whoever wins the next election needs to step back and be looking at the school sector in that way and taking that broader look, because over, even before the pandemic, this has been this increasing trend with schools stepping in and as this fourth emergency service. And I think we're at that point where we do need to step back and ask ourselves, what do we want schools to do? But on the second part of the question, in terms of the longer term impacts, I think this is exactly the point around, Andrew and Angus were both reflecting on the kind of wider financial outlook not being particularly rosy, and why should education have more money in that context? And actually education has kind of fared relatively well compared to other services. But I think the fundamental point is education is investing in human capital is one of the key ways in which we can ensure we have growth in the future, and we are investing in our long-term prosperity by investing in our young people. And I think the real risk of what's going on now is that it doesn't just have this profound impact on the people's and families going through it, but it's also going to have a long-term impact on our economy's future prospects, on society, on all of us. And actually, if we're going to be spending money on anything, we should be prioritising the things that are going to give us that long-term value, and investing in our young people is part of that.
Thanks so much. I think that was a really great end statement, really, and I think that sums up the school experience at the moment. While schools might have had a good amount of funding, it's the stuff they're doing outside of the classroom that is eating into their time. So I think that's something really important for us to leave our final thoughts on. So thank you so much for joining us today. Sorry that we can't talk more about what was announced, because not much was announced, but I think we had a really good discussion on the wider funding spectrum for schools and what we might expect from future governments as well. So thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day.